Amara Lewis stood at the marble kitchen island of their Chicago penthouse apartment, arranging hors d'oeuvres on a serving platter with the precision of someone who'd once orchestrated billion-dollar mergers. Her hands moved mechanically, muscle memory from countless corporate events she'd hosted in her former life, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying Daniel's words from that morning. Maybe if you actually contributed something to this household, we could afford the lakefront property I've been eyeing, he'd said, barely glancing up from his phone. The irony tasted bitter on her tongue. 3 years ago, Daniel couldn't get an interview to save his life, his resume collecting digital dust in countless HR databases across the city. Now, as a rising star at Morrison & Associates, one of the country's most prestigious consulting firms, he strutted around their home like he'd conquered the business world single-handedly. What Daniel didn't know, what Amara had sworn Rebecca Chin to secrecy about, was that every success he celebrated was built on a foundation she'd constructed in shadows. The sound of the front door opening pulled Amara from her thoughts. Daniel's voice boomed through the apartment before she even saw him, already holding court with someone on his phone. "Tell Jenkins the portfolio needs restructuring by Friday. No excuses," he barked, his tone dripping with the kind of authority Amara recognized from her own career, back when she was the one making those calls. He rounded the corner into the kitchen, ending the call with a theatrical flourish, and barely acknowledged her presence. "Is everything ready? Marcus Thompson is coming tonight, and I need this dinner to be perfect. He's considering me for the senior consultant track." Amara nodded, swallowing the words that threatened to spill out. Marcus Thompson, the same man who'd sat across from her at the university club 4 years ago, listening intently as she'd explained why Daniel Lewis, despite his rocky employment history, had the raw talent to become an asset to Morrison & Associates. The same man who'd trusted her judgment because she'd never steered the firm wrong during her 8 years as their go-to-strategy consultant. "And Amara," Daniel continued, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror without looking at her, "try to make conversation tonight, will you? I know you don't understand the corporate world anymore, but these people are important to my career." The words landed like physical blows. She'd spent the first 8 years of her career building the corporate strategies that companies like his now implemented. She'd been the youngest woman to make senior consultant at Morrison before she was 30. She'd walked away from a partnership track, from a 7-figure salary, from a corner office with her name on the door, all because Daniel had been floundering, his confidence shattered after his 3rd layoff in 2 years. "I need to focus on rebuilding," he'd said back then, vulnerable in ways she'd never seen him. "Could you take a step back, just temporarily? Your network, your reputation, it's overshadowing everything I try to do." So she had stepped back, telling herself it was temporary, that marriages required sacrifice, that lifting him up was an act of love. The doorbell chimed at exactly 7 o'clock. Marcus Thompson arrived with his characteristic punctuality, his silver-threaded suit immaculate, his presence filling the doorway with quiet authority. Behind him stood Rebecca Chin, Morrison's senior partner, and the only person besides Amara who knew the full truth. Rebecca's eyes met Amara's across the entryway, a flash of concern quickly masked by professional pleasantry. "Daniel," Marcus said warmly, shaking his hand. "Thank you for the invitation. And Amara." He turned to her with a subtle nod that contained volumes. "It's been too long." Daniel's arm snaked possessively around Amara's waist, his grip just a touch too tight. "Amara's been keeping busy at home," he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Someone has to make sure I'm fed, and the house runs smoothly while I'm building my career." The statement hung in the air, and Amara watched Rebecca's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. As they moved into the living room, Daniel launched into what Amara had come to recognize as his performance mode, regaling Marcus with stories of deals he'd closed, strategies he'd implemented, problems he'd solved. Each anecdote was punctuated with subtle digs at Amara's simpler lifestyle now, or lack of understanding about the pressure I'm under. Rebecca sipped her wine slowly, her expression neutral but her eyes alert, cataloging every slight. Marcus listened with the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen this particular play before. What Daniel didn't realize, what his ego wouldn't allow him to see, was that Marcus had built his career on reading people, on understanding the dynamics beneath the surface performance. When Daniel excused himself to take another important call from a client, Marcus leaned back in his chair and addressed Amara directly for the first time that evening. "How have you been, really?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Before Amara could answer, Before she could deploy one of her carefully crafted deflections, Rebecca interjected. "She's been invisible," Rebecca said quietly, her words precise as a scalpel. "And we both know why." Daniel's voice carried from the hallway before he reappeared, still animated from his phone call, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere that had occurred during his absence. He dropped back into his chair with the casual confidence of someone who believed the room revolved around him, reaching for his scotch with a satisfied smile. "Sorry about that. Duty calls even on a Saturday evening. You understand, Marcus, when you're responsible for multi-million-dollar accounts, the work never really stops." Marcus nodded slowly, but his attention remained on Amara, who'd gone very still in her chair, her hands folded in her lap like she was bracing for impact. Rebecca had set down her wine glass, and the crystal made a distinct sound against the marble coaster that seemed louder than it should have been. The room held its breath. "Daniel," Marcus began, his tone measured but carrying the weight of authority that came from 3 decades in executive leadership, "I wanted to ask you something that's been on my mind." Daniel straightened, clearly eager for what he assumed would be praise or perhaps discussion of his next promotion. "How do you think you landed the position at Morrison 4 years ago?" The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading across Daniel's confident expression. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "my interview performance was strong, my case study presentation was innovative, and I think the panel recognized my potential despite some gaps in my employment history." He glanced at Amara with a barely concealed smirk. "Though I was operating under some personal stress at the time, supporting a household on savings while waiting for the right opportunity." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that made Amara's stomach drop. Rebecca couldn't hold back anymore. "That's interesting," she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone choosing every word deliberately. "Because I remember your interview quite differently. You were the 14th candidate we'd seen for that position, and if I'm being honest, you weren't in our top 5. The room went silent except for the ambient sound of the city filtering through the windows. Daniel's face cycled through confusion, defensiveness, and the beginning of something that looked like fear. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Are you saying I didn't earn my position?" The question hung there, loaded with implications he wasn't ready to face. Amara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, years of careful silence about to shatter. She'd made Rebecca promise, had insisted on absolute anonymity, had been so certain that protecting Daniel's ego was the same thing as protecting their marriage. Marcus intervened before Rebecca could continue, his tone diplomatic but firm. "You earned your position through your work once you were in the door, Daniel. That's undeniable. Your performance reviews have been exceptional, your client relationships are strong, and your strategic thinking has impressed the entire partnership." Daniel visibly relaxed, but Marcus wasn't finished. "However, getting through that door, getting that initial interview when we'd already filled our candidate pipeline, getting a second and third interview when the committee had concerns about your resume gaps, that required intervention from someone with significant credibility at Morrison." The words settled over the room like snow, quiet but transformative. Daniel's eyes darted between Marcus and Rebecca, then landed on Amara with a look she couldn't quite read. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm saying," Marcus continued, his gaze steady on Daniel, "that 4 years ago, someone I trusted implicitly came to me with a recommendation. Someone whose judgment I'd relied on for nearly a decade, who'd never steered Morrison wrong, who'd helped us close some of our most significant contracts. This person sat across from me at the university club and spent 2 hours explaining why Daniel Lewis, despite appearances, was worth taking a chance on." The room seemed to shrink around them. Amara could feel Daniel's stare burning into her, could sense the exact moment the pieces started clicking together in his mind. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to realization, realization hardening into something darker. "Amara?" Her name came out as a question and an accusation simultaneously. She met his eyes for the first time that evening with her full strength, the version of herself she'd been suppressing for 4 years rising to the surface. "Yes," she said simply, her voice quiet but steady. "I called in every favor I had. I vouched for you when your resume said otherwise. I convinced Marcus and the hiring committee that your talent was worth the risk." The words spilled out now, years of silence breaking like a dam. "I did it because you were drowning, Daniel. Because I loved you and I believed in you. And I thought if I just helped you get your foot in the door, you'd thrive. And you did thrive. But somewhere along the way, You forgot that someone helped you reach that doorknob. Daniel stood abruptly, his Scotch glass hitting the side table with a sharp crack. You manipulated my career? You pitted me. His voice rose with each question. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? How humiliating this is? Rebecca stood as well, her voice cutting through Daniel's outburst like ice. What's humiliating is how you've treated your wife for the past 2 years. We've all noticed, Daniel. The dismissive comments at company events, the way you introduce her as just my wife, the casual cruelty you dress up as jokes. She crossed her arms, her senior partner authority fully engaged now. Amara Lewis was one of the most brilliant strategists Morrison ever had. She walked away from a partnership track to support your career. And instead of gratitude, instead of recognizing her sacrifice, you've spent the last 2 years making her feel small. The truth bombs kept falling, each one cracking Daniel's defensive armor a little more. Marcus added his voice to the indictment, calm but inexorable. Your quarterly review is next month, Daniel. The partnership committee will be assessing whether you're ready for senior consultant. I'll be honest with you now, your technical skills are there, but we have serious concerns about your character and judgment. The evening had transformed from a casual dinner into a reckoning. Daniel looked around the room, seeing for perhaps the first time how the power dynamics actually flowed, understanding that the 2 people who controlled his professional future were standing in his living room, defending the wife he'd spent years diminishing. I think, Marcus said quietly, standing and buttoning his suit jacket, that Rebecca and I should leave. You 2 have a lot to discuss. He turned to Amara, and his expression softened. Whatever you decide about your own path forward, know that Morrison's door is always open to you. We've held your consultant license active all these years, just in case you ever wanted to come back. The implications of that statement hit like thunder. She'd assumed when she stepped away that the door had closed behind her, that 4 years of absence had erased her from the firm's institutional memory. But they'd kept her credentials active, had maintained her clearance, had been waiting for her to reclaim her space. After Marcus and Rebecca left, the apartment felt cavernous in its silence. Daniel stood at the window, his back to Amara, his reflection ghost-like in the glass against the city lights. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier bravado. How long have they known? Amara stood, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. Rebecca has always known. Marcus figured it out about a year ago when you started making those comments at the summer gala. He pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. She moved toward the kitchen, needing the physical distance, needing to be doing something with her hands. Did you do it because you thought I couldn't make it on my own? Daniel's question was barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in his voice reminded her of the man she'd married, before success had poisoned him with arrogance. Amara paused in arranging the untouched hors d'oeuvres back into containers, her hands stilling over the fancy cheese she'd carefully selected that afternoon. I did it because I loved you, Daniel. Because relationships are supposed to be about lifting each other up, not keeping score. She turned to face him across the expanse of their expensive apartment, all the material success that had come at such a high cost. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your partner and started seeing me as your accessory. As someone living off your success, rather than someone who'd built the platform you're standing on. The truth settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Daniel turned from the window, and in the city light, Amara could see that his eyes were wet. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. Neither do I, she replied. But I know I can't keep living like this, making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. The question that had been building for 2 years finally crystallized in her mind. Had she saved his career only to lose herself? Amara woke at dawn to an empty bed, sunlight filtering through the partially open blinds, creating prison bar shadows across the white duvet. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through every moment of the previous evening, every revelation, every crack in the facade they'd been maintaining for years. The sound of running water told her Daniel was already in the shower, probably had been for a while based on the amount of steam seeping under the bathroom door. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling of their bedroom with its expensive recessed lighting and designer paint color that some magazine had declared the new neutral. Thinking about how much money they'd spent making this place look perfect while letting their actual lives fall apart. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. 3 messages, all from Jordan Hayes, her former colleague and closest friend from her Morrison days. The one person besides Rebecca who'd never stopped checking on her even after she'd withdrawn from the professional world. Rebecca texted me. Are you okay? Call me when you're ready to talk. Remember what I told you last year. You're not trapped unless you choose to be. Amara smiled despite everything, grateful for Jordan's persistent friendship, their refusal to let her disappear completely even when she'd tried. She typed back quickly, "I'm okay. Coffee tomorrow?" The response came within seconds. 11 a.m., our usual place. I'm not taking no for an answer. The bathroom door opened, releasing a cloud of steam, and Daniel emerged wrapped in a towel, his hair wet, his face carefully neutral like he was preparing for a business negotiation rather than a conversation with his wife. "We need to talk," he said, the same words that had started 1,000 difficult conversations throughout history, never getting any easier with repetition. Amara sat up, pulling the duvet around herself like armor. "Yes, we do." But Daniel didn't sit on the bed like he normally would have. Instead, he moved to the armchair in the corner, maintaining distance, maintaining control of the physical space. It reminded Amara of how he positioned himself in client meetings now, always strategic about where he sat, who he faced, how he commanded the room. Except this was their bedroom, and his wife wasn't a client to be managed. "I've been thinking all night," he began, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep or emotion or both. "About what Marcus and Rebecca said. About what you did for me." He paused, his hands gripping the chair arms. "Part of me wants to be grateful. Part of me is angry. And part of me is terrified that everything I've accomplished isn't really mine." Amara felt the familiar instinct to comfort him, to smooth over his discomfort, to make herself smaller so he could feel bigger. She'd been doing it so long it was almost automatic, the words forming in her mind. "Of course it's yours, you've worked so hard, you've earned everything." But something had shifted last night when Rebecca and Marcus had spoken the truth she'd been swallowing for years. Something had cracked open in her chest, and through that crack was seeping the version of herself she'd been before she'd decided that loving Daniel meant diminishing Amara. "Your accomplishments are yours, Daniel," she said finally, her voice steady. "I got you the interview. I vouched for your potential. But everything after that, every promotion, every client you've impressed, every strategy you've executed, that was you. I opened a door. You walked through it and built something." She paused, letting that truth settle. "But here's what I need you to understand. Opening that door cost me everything I'd built, and instead of acknowledging that sacrifice, you've spent 2 years treating me like I'm worthless." Daniel flinched at her words, but Amara continued, years of silence breaking like a fever. "You've called me a failure. You've mocked me at company events for not working. You've suggested I'm living off your salary like some kind of parasite. And every single time you did it, I remembered sitting across from Marcus 4 years ago, explaining why you deserved a chance despite 3 layoffs and gaps in your resume, putting my reputation on the line because I believed in you." Her voice cracked slightly but didn't break. "I gave up a partnership track, Daniel. Do you understand what that means? I gave up my career at Morrison to support yours because you told me you needed space to rebuild your confidence. And the day you got your promotion to senior consultant, the day you should have thanked me, you came home and complained that dinner wasn't ready on time." The room fell silent except for the ambient sounds of the city waking up outside. Traffic building, the distant sound of a siren, life continuing while their marriage faced its reckoning. Daniel's shoulders shook slightly, and Amara realized he was crying, really crying in a way she hadn't seen since the dark days before Morrison, when his 3rd layoff had sent him into a depression that scared them both. "I didn't know," he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "I mean, I knew you'd helped, but I didn't realize the extent. I didn't realize what it cost you." Amara wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that his cruelty had been born of ignorance rather than malice. But 2 years of casual abuse, of systematic belittling, of making her feel invisible in her own life, that wasn't something that happened by accident. "You didn't want to know," she corrected gently but firmly, "because knowing would have required you to feel grateful instead of entitled. It would have complicated your narrative about being a self-made success." Daniel looked up, his face blotchy and red, his carefully constructed facade completely stripped away. "What do you want me to do? How do I fix this?" he asked, and there was something almost childlike in his voice, like he genuinely didn't understand that some things couldn't be fixed with apologies or grand gestures. Amara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "I don't know if you can fix it, Daniel. I think maybe we're past fixing." She watched those words land, watched him process what she was really saying. "I've spent 4 years making myself smaller, quieter, less visible. I convinced myself it was love, that supporting your career was what good partners do. But love isn't supposed to erase you. Support isn't supposed to turn you into a ghost in your own life. She stood from the bed, wrapping herself in a silk robe that hung on the bedpost, needing to be on her feet for what came next. I need you to leave for a while. Stay at a hotel, stay with a friend, I don't care. But I need space to figure out who I am without you, without the constant effort of trying to make myself palatable to someone who sees me as a burden. You're kicking me out? Daniel's voice rose with disbelief and anger. Of our home? I pay for this place. And there it was, the ego reasserting itself even in crisis, the need to remind her of financial power dynamics, to put her back in the position of dependent. Amara felt something cold settle in her chest, something that felt almost like relief. Because this reaction told her everything she needed to know about whether Daniel was actually capable of change or just performing remorse. Actually, she said, her voice ice-cold now, the corporate strategist she used to be coming fully back online. If we're going to talk about who pays for what, let's be accurate. This apartment is in both our names. The down payment came from my savings, money I'd earned in my 8 years at Morrison before I stepped back. The mortgage is paid from a joint account that, yes, currently has more of your income in it, but is legally owned by both of us. So no, Daniel, you don't get to use money as a weapon here. The silence that followed was different from before, charged with the electricity of something fundamental shifting. Daniel seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that the woman standing before him wasn't the diminished version he'd grown accustomed to living with. This was Amara Lewis, who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, who'd earned a partnership track before 30, who'd commanded respect in boardrooms across Chicago. She'd been there all along, just buried under his need to feel superior. Fine, he said finally, moving toward the walk-in closet, his movements sharp with anger and humiliation. I'll pack a bag. I'll stay at the Marriott downtown. But this isn't over, Amara. We're married. You don't just get to throw that away, because I said some things that hurt your feelings. She almost laughed at the reduction of 2 years of emotional abuse to some things that hurt your feelings. But she was too tired to engage with his minimization. Pack enough for a week, she said simply. We'll figure out next steps after we've both had time to think. 20 minutes later, Daniel stood at the apartment door with a hastily packed overnight bag, dressed now in casual clothes that looked wrong on him somehow, too relaxed for the tension thrumming through his body. We should talk about what this means for work, he said, his mind already spinning toward damage control, toward managing the narrative. What are you going to tell Marcus and Rebecca? Amara leaned against the kitchen island, that same spot where she'd stood last night arranging hors d'oeuvres for a dinner party that had ended in catastrophe. I'm not going to tell them anything, she said. Your professional relationship with Morrison is yours to manage. But Daniel, if you're worried about them respecting you less, maybe ask yourself why you think respecting your wife and being successful at work are mutually exclusive. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, seeming to realize there was no good answer to that question. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded remarkably like an ending. The coffee shop tucked into a converted brownstone in Lincoln Park had been Amara and Jordan's place for years, back when they were both young consultants racing toward the top of Morrison's hierarchy, competing and collaborating in equal measure. Walking through the door felt like stepping into a time machine, the smell of espresso and the warm lighting transporting Amara to a version of herself that existed before Daniel's insecurities became her responsibility. Jordan was already at their usual table by the window, their short silver hair catching the late morning light, laptop open but ignored as they watched the door. The moment their eyes met, Jordan stood, and Amara found herself wrapped in a hug that threatened to break her careful composure. I've been worried about you for 2 years, Jordan said without preamble once they'd sat down, their directness one of the things Amara had always loved about them. Actually longer than that, since you first told me you were stepping back from Morrison to support Daniel's transition. They made air quotes with their fingers, their expressions somewhere between concern and frustration. I knew then it was a mistake, but you were so convinced it was temporary, so sure he'd get on his feet and you'd come back. Amara wrapped her hands around the cappuccino Jordan had already ordered for her, needing the warmth even though the day wasn't particularly cold. I thought I was being a good partner, she said quietly. I thought that's what love looked like, making sacrifices for someone else's happiness. Jordan leaned back in their chair, studying her with the analytical gaze that made them brilliant at reading corporate politics. Love doesn't require you to disappear, Amara. That's not sacrifice, that's self-erasure. There's a difference. The barista brought over Jordan's black coffee, giving them a moment of silence. When she left, Jordan reached across the table and took Amara's hand. Rebecca called me last night after the dinner. She told me what happened, about Daniel's reaction, about the truth coming out. They squeezed her hand gently. She also told me you kicked him out. I'm proud of you. Amara felt tears threatening, the kind that came from being seen and supported after years of feeling invisible. I don't know if I did the right thing, she admitted. Part of me wants to believe he can change, that maybe this shock will wake him up to how he's been treating me. Jordan's expression shifted to something more complicated, and Amara felt a cold finger of dread trace down her spine. What? She asked. What aren't you telling me? Jordan hesitated, clearly warring with themselves about whether to share something, then seemed to make a decision. There's something you should know, something I found out about 6 months ago, but didn't know how to tell you. Amara's stomach dropped. Whatever Jordan was about to say, it was going to hurt. She could see it in their eyes, in the way they were bracing themselves for her reaction. Just tell me, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Whatever it is, I'd rather know. Jordan pulled out their phone, scrolling through something, then turned it toward Amara. It was a photo, clearly taken at some kind of after-work event, showing Daniel with his arm around a young woman Amara recognized as one of Morrison's junior analysts. They were laughing, standing too close, his hand on her lower back in a way that was too familiar, too intimate. The timestamp showed it was from 3 months ago. This was at the Q2 celebration at that rooftop bar in the Loop, Jordan explained, their voice gentle but firm. I wasn't there, but Maya from accounting sent this to me because she knows we're close. She said Daniel spent most of the night with this woman, Elise Chun, Rebecca's niece actually, and that he was introducing her to clients as his secret weapon. Amara felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her mind raced through possibilities, explanations, justifications, but Jordan wasn't finished. They scrolled to another photo, this one more recent based on Daniel's haircut, showing him at what looked like a corporate dinner. The same woman seated next to him, his hand on the table close to hers, both of them looking at something on his phone with their heads bent together. I don't think it's physical, Jordan said carefully. At least, I haven't seen or heard anything that suggests that. But Amara, he's doing with her what he should be doing with you. He's making her visible, crediting her with ideas, positioning her as important. Maya said she heard him tell a client that Elise was the brilliant mind behind our latest strategy, which, by the way, was actually a modified version of a framework you developed 5 years ago. I checked. The irony was so sharp it almost made Amara laugh. Daniel had spent 2 years making her feel worthless, erasing her contributions, positioning her as a burden, while simultaneously building up another woman with the exact qualities he'd dismissed in his wife. Does Rebecca know? Amara asked, her voice hollow. About her niece and Daniel? Jordan nodded. She found out recently, which is part of why she was so fierce at dinner last night. Elise is young, only 24, fresh out of grad school. Rebecca is furious that Daniel is using her niece to boost his own profile, while treating his wife like garbage. She's been trying to figure out how to tell you without it seeming like she's interfering. Amara's cappuccino had gone cold in her hands, forgotten as the pieces continued to click into place. All those late nights Daniel claimed were client dinners. All those conferences he attended without her. All those times he'd made her feel crazy for questioning why he never wanted her at company events anymore. He'd been creating a professional life that didn't include her. One where he could be the undisputed star with a young protege who saw him as brilliant rather than a wife who knew exactly how much help he'd needed. I'm sorry, Jordan said quietly. I should have told you sooner. I just kept hoping I was reading too much into it, that maybe it was innocent mentorship. But after Rebecca told me how he's been treating you at home, I realized this is part of a pattern. He's erasing you from his professional narrative and replacing you with someone who doesn't threaten his ego. The words cut because they were true. Daniel hadn't just been cruel, he'd been strategic about it, systematically removing Amara from his success story while building a new narrative that centered him as the sole architect of his achievements. Amara felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clarifying, burning away the last vestiges of guilt about kicking him out. I want to see all of it, she said suddenly, her voice hard. Whatever photos Maya has, whatever stories you've heard. I need to see the full picture of what he's been doing while calling me a failure at home. Jordan pulled up their messages, scrolling through a thread with Maya that contained a trail of observations over the past 6 months. Photos from various corporate events, Always Daniel and Elise positioned as a team. Screenshots of the company's internal newsletter, where Daniel had credited my incredible colleague Elise Chen for projects Amara recognized as derivative of her old work. A forwarded email chain where Daniel had recommended Elise for a high-profile client presentation, writing, "She's the future of this firm." Each piece of evidence was a small cut, but together they formed a portrait of systematic replacement. This wasn't just about Daniel being a bad husband. It was about him actively constructing a professional identity that erased Amara while elevating someone who made him look good. Someone young enough to see him as impressive rather than as the project he'd been when Amara first convinced Morrison to take a chance on him. "The worst part," Amara said slowly, processing everything she was seeing, "is that I think part of him genuinely doesn't see what he's doing is wrong. He's convinced himself that his success is entirely his own, that I was just a housewife who happened to make a phone call once. Meanwhile, he's doing for Elise exactly what I did for him, using his position to elevate someone else's career. But somehow when he does it, it's mentorship and leadership, and when I did it, it was manipulation and pity." The hypocrisy was staggering. Jordan closed their phone and set it aside, leaning forward with intensity. "So what are you going to do? Because you have options here, Amara. More options than you probably realize." Amara looked at her friend, at the fierce loyalty in their eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. For 4 years, she'd been living in Daniel's narrative, seeing herself through his increasingly critical eyes, internalizing his message that she was less than, that she was failing, that she should be grateful he tolerated her. But sitting here with Jordan, seeing the evidence of Daniel's duplicity, something clarity emerged from the anger. "I'm going to take back my life," Amara said, and hearing the words out loud felt like breaking a spell. "I'm going to call Marcus tomorrow and tell him I want to discuss reactivating my consultant position at Morrison. I'm going to stop shrinking myself to make room for Daniel's ego. And I'm going to make very sure that the partnership committee knows exactly what kind of character Daniel has before they consider him for senior consultant." Jordan's face broke into a fierce smile. "That's my Amara. The woman I remember. The one who walked into boardrooms and made CEOs nervous because she was 3 steps ahead of everyone else." They raised their coffee cup in a mock toast. "Welcome back. We've missed you." The cafe door opened, bringing in a gust of November wind and a group of laughing college students, their easy joy a stark contrast to the serious conversation happening in the corner. But Amara felt something she hadn't felt in years, excited about her future. Nervous, yes. Angry, absolutely. But also awake in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Morrison and Associates occupied floors 30 through 35 of the glass tower on West Monroe Street, its reception area a statement of understated power with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River. Amara stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her reflection in the glass showing a professional she'd almost forgotten existed. Tailored navy suit that she'd had to dig out from the back of her closet, portfolio bag that still held her old business cards, heels that made a satisfying click against pavement. Her natural curly hair was pulled back in the sleek bun she used to wear every day, and for the first time in years, she felt like herself. Marcus had responded to her call within an hour yesterday, his voice warm but unsurprised when she'd asked about reactivating her consultant position. "I was wondering when you'd be ready," he'd said simply. "Come in Tuesday morning. We'll talk." The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt both endless and instantaneous, her stomach doing complicated maneuvers that had nothing to do with the ascent. What if she'd been gone too long? What if her skills had atrophied? What if she walked back in and discovered that the brilliant strategist she'd been had disappeared along with her confidence? But then the doors opened onto the Morrison reception area, and Jennifer at the front desk looked up and gasped. "Amara Lewis? Oh my God, is it really you?" The genuine delight in the receptionist's voice was the first crack in Amara's armor of nervousness. "Hi, Jennifer. It's been a while." "A while? Try 4 years. We've missed you around here." Half the consultants still reference your Henderson merger strategy when they're stuck on complex deals. Jennifer was already picking up the phone, her excitement palpable. "Let me tell Marcus you're here. He's been talking about you all morning." Marcus appeared in the reception area himself, rather than sending an assistant, a gesture that spoke volumes about how Morrison viewed this meeting. He'd aged slightly in 4 years, a bit more silver at his temples, but his presence remained commanding, the kind of leader people instinctively trusted. "Amara," he said, extending his hand with a smile that reached his eyes. Welcome home. The word home hit her harder than expected, and she had to blink back unexpected tears as she shook his hand. He ushered her through the open office space, and heads turned as they passed. Some faces were familiar, consultants who'd been junior when she left, now sitting at desks with more responsibility. Others were new, young professionals who didn't know who she was but could read the room well enough to recognize that Marcus Thompson personally escorting someone meant they were important. Sarah Kim, who'd been a peer before Amara left, looked up from a client meeting in a glass conference room and actually stood up, her mouth falling open in recognition. Marcus's office occupied a corner of the 33rd floor, windows on two sides providing views of both the river and the city skyline. Rebecca was already there, seated in one of the leather chairs facing Marcus's desk, and she stood when Amara entered, embracing her with fierce warmth. "I'm so glad you called," Rebecca said quietly, for Amara's ears only. "I've been hoping for this for 2 years." They settled into chairs, and Marcus moved around his desk. But this felt nothing like the confrontational positioning from Saturday night at the apartment. This was a negotiation between equals, a conversation between professionals who respected each other. "Let me be direct," Marcus began, his style as always. "We want you back, Amara. We've wanted you back since the day you left. Your consultant license has remained active, your security clearance current, your profit-sharing account accruing value. We didn't consider you gone, we considered you on an extended leave." Amara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I wasn't sure there would be a place for me anymore. 4 years is a long time in this industry. Strategies evolve, approaches change. I wasn't sure my skills would still be relevant." Rebecca made a dismissive sound. "Amara, you wrote half the playbook we still use. The Lewis framework for evaluating merger synergies? We teach that to every new consultant. The stakeholder mapping system you developed? It's literally in our training materials with your name on it. You didn't become irrelevant, you became foundational." The words settled around Amara like a warm blanket, rewriting narratives she'd internalized during 4 years of Daniel's dismissiveness. She hadn't been wasting away at home being useless. She'd been the invisible foundation that others built upon, her contributions living on even in her absence. Marcus pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk toward her. "This is a reactivation proposal. Senior consultant level, which is where you would have been if you'd stayed. Full benefits, profit sharing, your choice of team assignments. We'd start you on the Meridian Healthcare integration. It's exactly the kind of complex multi-stakeholder situation you excel at." Amara opened the folder, scanning the terms. The salary made her breath catch, nearly double what she'd been making when she left, reflecting both the years that had passed and the senior-level position. The benefits package was comprehensive, the profit-sharing structure generous. But it was the title that hit her hardest: Senior Strategic Consultant Partnership Track. They weren't just bringing her back, they were putting her back on the path she'd abandoned. "There's something we need to discuss," Rebecca said, her tone shifting slightly. "Daniel." The name hung in the air, unavoidable. Amara had known this would come up, had spent the past day thinking about how to handle the awkwardness of working at the same firm as her estranged husband, especially given everything that had happened. "He doesn't know you're here," Marcus said carefully. "He doesn't know you've called, doesn't know we're meeting. We wanted to be clear with you first. Your career decisions and his are completely separate. We're offering you this position because you're Amara Lewis, not because of any relationship with Daniel Lewis. His performance review and your career trajectory are independent issues." "However," Rebecca continued, and Amara heard the steel underneath the diplomatic language, "you should know that Daniel's senior consultant review has been postponed. The partnership committee has concerns about his judgment and character, particularly regarding how he's managed relationships within the firm." She paused delicately. "My niece Elise has filed a complaint with HR. Not about anything illegal, but about feeling uncomfortable with how Daniel has been positioning their working relationship, taking credit for her ideas, introducing her to clients in ways that suggested inappropriate familiarity." Amara absorbed this information with grim satisfaction. So Elise wasn't as enamored with Daniel's mentorship as the photos had suggested. The young woman had recognized what was happening and taken action, something Amara should have done years ago. "I see," Amara said carefully. "And where does that leave things?" Marcus took over the explanation. "It leaves Daniel in a precarious position professionally. His technical work is good, but culture fit and ethical behavior are just as important to partnership consideration. The committee is conducting a review of his conduct over the past 18 months, interviewing team members, reviewing how he's credited work, examining his collaborative approach. He looked directly at Amara. Your reactivation doesn't impact that review one way or another. But I want you to know, we're not a firm that tolerates people building their success by diminishing others, whether that's a spouse, a junior colleague, or anyone else. The message was clear. Morrison knew about how Daniel had treated Amara, and they weren't impressed. The firm that Daniel thought he'd conquered was actually holding him accountable for the very behavior he'd thought made him look strong. Amara felt a wave of vindication, so strong it was almost dizzying. I want the position, she said, her voice steady and clear. I want to come back, to work on the Meridian project, to rebuild the career I walked away from. And I want to do it on my own merits, separate from whatever happens with Daniel. Marcus stood, extending his hand across the desk. Then welcome back, Senior Consultant Lewis. You start Monday, which gives you the rest of this week to prepare. Rebecca will be your direct report supervisor, and she'll introduce you to the Meridian team on your first day. As Amara shook his hand, feeling the solid reality of this decision, the office door opened and someone walked past in the hallway. Through the glass wall of Marcus's office, Amara saw Daniel freeze mid-stride, his expression cycling through confusion, shock, and something that looked like panic as he registered her presence in Morrison's executive suite. Dressed professionally, clearly in a meeting with the two most powerful partners in the firm. Their eyes met through the glass for one suspended moment. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came through the barrier. Amara held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to shrink, letting him see exactly who she was. Not his diminished wife living off his salary, but Amara Lewis, senior strategic consultant, the woman who'd built the foundation he was standing on. Then Amara turned away from him, dismissing him without a word, and returned her attention to Rebecca, who was explaining the Meridian project details. Behind her, through the glass, she sensed rather than saw Daniel walk away, his confident stride now uncertain. The moment felt like closing a chapter and opening a new one simultaneously. One more thing, Rebecca said, a slight smile playing at her lips. Your old office on the 34th floor? We kept it empty. Said we were using it for storage, but really we were just hoping you'd come back to claim it. Amara felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she'd cried over Daniel's cruelty. These were tears of being valued, of being remembered, of coming home to a place that had held space for her even when she'd forgotten to hold space for herself. Amara spent the rest of Tuesday afternoon at Morrison, meeting with Rebecca's team, reviewing the Meridian healthcare file, and slowly remembering what it felt like to think about strategy and stakeholder management instead of whether dinner would be ready on time. By 6 p.m., when she finally left the building with a stack of briefing documents and her old security badge reactivated, she felt simultaneously exhausted and more alive than she had in years. The apartment was dark when she arrived, and for a moment, she enjoyed the silence, the space that was just hers without Daniel's presence filling it with tension. She'd changed into comfortable clothes and was reviewing the Meridian files at the kitchen island, notes spreading across the marble surface, when she heard the key in the lock. Daniel entered like a storm system, his energy agitated and aggressive, and Amara's peaceful evening evaporated instantly. What the hell were you doing at Morrison today? Daniel's voice was too loud for the space, carrying the particular edge of someone whose control was slipping. He hadn't even closed the door behind him properly, just left it hanging open like he was ready to storm back out at any moment. Amara looked up from her documents slowly, deliberately, refusing to let his anger dictate her response time. I was meeting with Marcus and Rebecca about reactivating my consultant position. I start Monday. She returned her attention to the Meridian file, letting the casualness of her response speak volumes about how little his opinion mattered to her professional decisions. Daniel's face flushed red, a vein in his temple becoming visible. You start Monday? You didn't think to discuss this with me first? To ask how I'd feel about my wife suddenly working at my firm. Amara set down her pen with deliberate precision, finally turning to face him fully. I'm sorry, when did you ask my permission before accepting your job at Morrison 4 years ago? Oh wait, that's right, you didn't. You just accepted the position I secured for you and never looked back. The reminder of his debt to her hit its mark, and Daniel's expression twisted. That's different and you know it. I needed that job. You're just doing this to humiliate me, to undermine my position at the firm. His accusation would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing about his mindset. Everything was still about him, his position, his reputation, his feelings. The idea that Amara might want to return to work for her own fulfillment, for her own career, for her own identity, didn't even register as a possibility. Actually, Amara said, her voice cold as ice, I'm doing this because I'm a talented strategic consultant who walked away from a promising career to support a husband who repaid that sacrifice with contempt. Morrison wants me back because I'm good at what I do, not because of any connection to you. Daniel laughed, but it was harsh and bitter. Is that what they told you? That they want you for your skills? He moved closer to the island, his hands bracing against the marble surface. Or maybe they want you because it makes them look good, brings back the diversity hire they lost when you quit. Maybe they're using you to make a point to me, to keep me in line. The words diversity hire hit like a slap, revealing layers of resentment Daniel had apparently been harboring for years. Amara felt her calm facade crack, anger flooding through the fissures. Diversity hire? Her voice was dangerously quiet. I was the youngest senior consultant Morrison had ever promoted. I closed the Henderson merger that everyone said was impossible. I developed frameworks that the firm still uses today. But sure, Daniel. Reduce all of that to my skin color because it's easier for your ego than admitting your wife was actually more successful than you. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Daniel seemed to realize he'd crossed a line, his expression shifting from anger to something more complicated. I didn't mean it like that, he started, but Amara cut him off with a sharp gesture. Yes, you did. You absolutely meant it exactly like that. And you know what the worst part is? I convinced myself for years that you weren't that guy, that your insecurity wasn't rooted in misogyny and racism, that you were just struggling with your own confidence. But I was wrong. You've been resentful of me from the beginning, haven't you? Resentful that I had success you couldn't achieve, that I had a network you needed, that I was respected in rooms where you couldn't get through the door. The truth was spilling out now, years of careful denial breaking apart under the weight of accumulated evidence. Daniel's face went through several expressions before settling on defensive anger again. You want to talk about resentment? How do you think it felt knowing my wife was always 3 steps ahead of me? That people would ask me how I landed such an accomplished woman? That at every event, someone would mention your work and ask what I did, like I was your accessory. So you decided to destroy me, Amara said slowly, understanding crystallizing. You systematically tore down my confidence, made me feel worthless, isolated me from my professional network. Also, you could feel like the big man? Feel like you were finally the successful one. Daniel whirled on her. I didn't destroy you. You chose to step back, chose to support my career, chose to stay home. Don't rewrite history to make yourself the victim here. Amara laughed, and it was a sound without humor. You're right, I did choose those things. I chose them because you told me you needed space to rebuild your confidence. You told me my success was emasculating you. You told me that if I just gave you 2 years, you'd get stable, and then we'd be partners again. I chose to believe you. She picked up her wine glass, needing something to do with her hands. But you lied. Because the moment you got success, you didn't want a partner. You wanted a dependent. Someone you could feel superior to. Someone who validated your fragile ego by being less than you. The apartment door, which Daniel had left ajar in his angry entry, suddenly pushed fully open. Both Amara and Daniel turned to see Elise Chin standing in the doorway, her expression uncertain, clearly having heard at least part of the argument. She was younger than Amara had realized from the photos, barely out of graduate school, her professional attire slightly disheveled like she'd been working late. Daniel, she said quietly, her eyes darting between him and Amara. You left your phone at the office. I thought you might need it. Her voice trailed off as she took in the scene, the obvious tension. Amara's work documents spread across the island. You called her, Amara said, not a question. Daniel had the grace to look uncomfortable. I needed to talk to someone about what happened today, about you suddenly showing up at Morrison. Elise understands the firm dynamics. I just wanted advice. Oh my God, Elise interrupted, her face going pale. You're Amara Lewis. The Amara Lewis. You developed the stakeholder framework we use. You're legendary at Morrison. She looked between them again, understanding clearly dawning. You're also Daniel's wife. The one he's been. She stopped, clearly realizing she was about to say something damaging. Been what? Amara prompted, her voice gentle toward Elise, but her eyes hard on Daniel. What has Daniel been telling you about me? Elise shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing she'd just left the phone with the doorman. He said, He said his wife didn't understand his work, that she'd never had a real career, that she didn't support his ambitions. She looked at Amara with something like apology in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, I had no idea. If I'd known who you were, I never would have." She trailed off again. But the implication was clear. Daniel had been feeding Elise a completely fictional version of his marriage, positioning Amara as an obstacle to overcome rather than the person who'd made his career possible. "Never would have what?" Daniel asked sharply, and there was something almost panicked in his voice now, like he could feel control of multiple narratives slipping simultaneously. Elise straightened her spine, and Amara recognized the look of someone who'd decided they were done being manipulated. "Never would have let you take credit for my analysis on the Brookfield account. Never would have stayed quiet when you introduced me to clients as your secret weapon. Never would have bought your story about being an underappreciated genius married to someone who didn't get you." Daniel looked between the two women, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. "Elise, you don't understand. I've been helping you, mentoring you." "You've been using me," Elise corrected, her voice firm despite her obvious discomfort with confrontation. "My aunt figured it out weeks ago, and she helped me see it too. You positioned our working relationship to make yourself look good, took credit for my ideas, and created an image of inappropriate closeness that made me uncomfortable." She held out his phone. "I came here tonight to tell you I'm requesting a team transfer. I don't want to work with you anymore." The phone hung between them, and when Daniel didn't immediately take it, Elise set it on the entryway table. "Mrs. Lewis," she said, turning to Amara, "I'm really sorry if I contributed to any problems in your marriage. I didn't know the truth." Amara felt unexpected sympathy for this young woman who'd been caught in Daniel's web of self-aggrandizement. "You didn't contribute to anything, Elise. You were just doing your job. Daniel's choices are his own." After Elise left, pulling the door firmly closed behind her, the silence in the apartment was absolute. Daniel stood in the middle of the living room like someone who'd been hit by a truck, his carefully constructed world falling apart piece by piece. "This is your fault," he said finally, his voice hollow. "You coming back to Morrison, you've poisoned everyone against me. You've ruined everything." Amara gathered her documents from the island, stacking them with precise movements. "I didn't ruin anything, Daniel. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. You built your success on lies, on taking credit for other people's work, on diminishing anyone who made you feel inadequate. That's not my fault, that's yours." She picked up her stack of files, heading toward the bedroom. "I want you out of this apartment by the weekend. We'll figure out divorce logistics through lawyers. You can stay at your hotel until you find something permanent." The word divorce seemed to snap Daniel out of his shock. "Wait, divorce? We're not even going to try to work through this." Amara stopped in the bedroom doorway, looking back at him one last time. "There's nothing to work through, Daniel. You didn't just hurt me, you showed me exactly who you are. And I don't want to be married to that person." Amara arrived at Morrison at 7:30 Monday morning, earlier than necessary, but unable to stay in the apartment any longer. Daniel had moved his essentials out over the weekend in tense silence, and the space now felt like a museum of a failed marriage, full of expensive furniture and empty of life. The security guard at Morrison's ground floor entrance, Mike, did a double take when she presented her badge. "Ms. Lewis? Welcome back. Been a long time." His genuine warmth loosened some of the tension in her shoulders. "Thanks, Mike. Good to be back." The elevator ride was crowded with Monday morning energy, consultants discussing weekend plans and upcoming client meetings, and Amara let the familiar rhythm of corporate conversation wash over her. Her old office on the 34th floor was exactly as Rebecca had promised, like stepping into a time capsule. The furniture was the same, her old desk nameplate stored in the drawer, even some of her books still on the shelf though covered in dust. But what made her breath catch was the whiteboard on the wall, which still showed her last strategic diagram from 4 years ago, preserved like archaeological evidence of who she'd been. "I told facilities not to clean it," Rebecca's voice came from the doorway. She was holding 2 coffees from the good place down the street, not the office swill. "Figured you might want to see it one more time before starting fresh." Amara accepted the coffee gratefully, staring at the whiteboard, at her own handwriting mapping out stakeholder relationships for a merger that had closed successfully months after she left. "The Wellington acquisition," she said softly. "I worked on this for 6 months before I stepped away." Rebecca moved into the office, setting her own coffee on the desk. You should know, word has spread about Saturday night's dinner. About Daniel, about your history with the firm, about what really happened 4 years ago." She paused, measuring her words. "People are asking questions, and I've been as discreet as possible, but in a firm this size, gossip travels." Amara had expected this, but it still made her stomach clench. "What are they saying?" Rebecca's expression was carefully neutral. "That you were the power behind Daniel's throne, that he built his career by standing on your shoulders, that his treatment of you was worse than anyone realized." She met Amara's eyes. Some people are angry they didn't know the truth. Some feel guilty for not seeing what was happening. And a few are questioning whether Daniel's work product was ever really his own. The implications of that last statement hung heavy in the air. If Morrison's consultants started questioning Daniel's legitimacy, his career at the firm was effectively over. Amara should have felt satisfied, but instead, she felt tired. "I never wanted to destroy him," she said quietly. "I know," Rebecca said gently. "But you also can't protect him from the consequences of his own actions anymore. He made choices about how to treat you, how to credit work, how to position himself. Those choices have consequences." She sipped her coffee. The partnership review committee met over the weekend. Daniel's promotion to senior consultant has been indefinitely postponed pending the investigation into his conduct. Several junior consultants have come forward with concerns about how he managed collaborative projects, about credit attribution, about his leadership style. Before Amara could respond, Sarah Kim appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath like she'd run up the stairs. "Amara!" She rushed in for a hug that lifted Amara off her feet. "I couldn't believe it when I saw you last week. You're really back? For real?" The genuine excitement was infectious, and Amara found herself laughing despite the heavy conversation with Rebecca. "I'm really back. Senior consultant, starting today on the Meridian project." Sarah's face lit up even more. "The Meridian integration? That's my project. We're going to be working together? This is amazing." The morning moved quickly after that, a whirlwind of reintroductions and briefings. The Meridian healthcare integration was massive, involving 3 regional hospital systems merging into one entity, with all the complexities of healthcare regulations, union negotiations, and competing organizational cultures. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, multi-layered challenge that Amara had always excelled at, and she felt her strategic mind engage in ways it hadn't in years. By 10 a.m., she was in a conference room with the full Meridian team, 12 consultants ranging from junior analysts to senior strategists. Sarah was there, along with several faces Amara didn't recognize and a few she remembered from before. Marcus stopped by to make the formal introduction. "Team, I want to welcome back senior consultant Amara Lewis. Some of you know her reputation. Some of you may have used her frameworks in your training. She's joining as co-lead on this project with Sarah, bringing extensive experience with complex stakeholder management in healthcare contexts." The meeting progressed smoothly, and Amara felt herself sliding back into consultant mode, like putting on a familiar jacket. She asked incisive questions about union relationships, identified potential resistance points in the merger timeline, and suggested a stakeholder mapping approach that had the whole team nodding in recognition. "That's the Lewis framework," a young analyst said with excitement. "We learned this in training, but seeing you apply it in real time is completely different." Amara smiled. "The framework is just a tool. The art is in understanding the human dynamics underneath the organizational charts." As she spoke, she noticed movement outside the conference room's glass walls. Daniel was walking past with a client, clearly giving a tour or heading to a meeting. He glanced into the conference room, and for one suspended moment their eyes met. He saw her in her element, commanding a room full of talented consultants, being treated as the expert she was. His expression cycled through emotions too quickly to read before he turned away and continued walking, his stride less confident than it had been. After the meeting, Sarah pulled Amara aside in the hallway. "Can I ask you something?" Her expression was serious now, the earlier excitement tempered by concern. "About Daniel?" Amara steeled herself. "You can ask. I may not answer, but you can ask." Sarah chose her words carefully. "We've been hearing things about your history with him, about what happened before you left Morrison. I just want you to know that a lot of us had no idea. If we'd known, if we'd understood what was really going on." She trailed off, clearly struggling. "Some of us worked with Daniel on projects. Some of us considered him a mentor. And now we're realizing we may have been complicit in treating you like you were invisible." Amara felt her throat tighten. You weren't complicit, Sarah. You didn't know the full story because I kept it hidden. I made that choice, and I have to own the consequences. But we should have seen it, Sarah insisted. The way he talked about you at company events, the casual dismissiveness, the way he never credited you for anything even though everyone knew you must have been the one who got him the interview. We should have said something. Amara placed a hand on Sarah's arm. The fact that you're saying something now matters. The fact that you're questioning what you saw and didn't act on, that's growth. That's what I need from colleagues going forward, not guilt about the past. They walked together toward the elevators, Sarah explaining more about the Meridian project timeline. But Amara's attention was pulled by voices coming from Marcus's office. The door was partially open, and she could hear Marcus's measured tones followed by Daniel's voice, higher pitched than usual, defensive. I'm being punished for my personal life affecting my professional reputation. But that's exactly what's happening to me because of rumors and gossip. Marcus's response was firm. You're being held accountable for your professional conduct, which includes how you manage collaborative relationships and credit attribution. The committee's concerns predate any personal revelations. Sarah pulled Amara away from the door before the conversation became more audible. Come on, let's get lunch. There's a new place that does amazing poke bowls, and I want to hear about your approach to the union negotiations for Meridian. As they rode the elevator down, Amara felt the surreal juxtaposition of her two realities. Upstairs, her estranged husband was being held accountable for behavior she'd enabled by staying silent. Down here, she was being welcomed back into a professional community that valued her expertise. Both were necessary, both were painful, both were part of rebuilding a life she'd let crumble. The restaurant was crowded with the lunch rush, young professionals and corporate types mixing with students from nearby colleges. Sarah ordered for both of them, clearly a regular, and they found a table by the window overlooking the river. I have a confession, Sarah said once they'd settled. When you left Morrison 4 years ago, I was angry with you. Amara looked up, surprised. Angry? Why? Sarah played with her chopsticks, not quite meeting Amara's eyes. Because you were my role model. You were proof that women could make senior consultant before 30, that we could be taken seriously in strategy. When you left, I felt abandoned. It sounds selfish now, saying it out loud, but I needed you here as evidence that it was possible. The honesty was refreshing, even if it stung slightly. And then, Sarah continued, Daniel started rising quickly, and everyone whispered about how he'd married well, how his wife must have helped him, but we never talked about it directly. We just watched him get promoted while making jokes about his unemployed wife, and I'm realizing now how complicit that silence was. Amara set down her fork, needing to say this clearly. Sarah, I'm going to tell you something that took me 4 years to understand. My choices were mine. I chose to step back, chose to make Daniel's career the priority, chose to stay silent about my contributions. Were those choices influenced by his manipulation? Yes, but I still made them. And part of reclaiming my life is owning those choices. The Meridian healthcare integration was complex enough to demand every bit of her strategic expertise, and she'd thrown herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her. Late nights at the office, early morning calls with hospital administrators, weekend sessions mapping stakeholder concerns across 3 different organizational cultures. Sarah had proven to be an exceptional partner, matching Amara's work ethic while bringing fresh perspectives that challenged assumptions. They developed what Amara recognized as the kind of professional chemistry that produced breakthrough work, the kind she'd once thought she might have with Daniel before his insecurity poisoned everything. But today was different. Today was the presentation to Meridian's full board of directors, 15 powerful healthcare executives who would ultimately approve or reject Morrison's integration strategy. It was Amara's first major client presentation since returning, and despite her confidence in the work, she felt the familiar pre-presentation adrenaline mixed with something newer. The fear that maybe Daniel had been right, maybe she'd lost her edge during those 4 years away. You're going to be brilliant, Rebecca said from the doorway, arriving at 6:30 a.m. with breakfast sandwiches and more coffee. I've seen your deck. It's exactly what they need to hear, delivered in a way that respects their concerns while showing clear path forward. Amara accepted the sandwich gratefully, realizing she'd forgotten to eat dinner the night before. What if I've forgotten how to read a room? What if 4 years of not doing this has made me rusty at the interpersonal dynamics? Rebecca sat down, fixing Amara with a serious look. You spent 4 years reading the most difficult room imaginable, a home where you had to constantly calibrate your words and actions to avoid triggering your husband's insecurity. If you could navigate that minefield successfully, a boardroom full of healthcare executives will be easy. The comparison was darkly apt, and Amara found herself laughing despite her nerves. When you put it that way, I've been doing advanced difficulty negotiations for years. The presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Meridian's headquarters in the West Loop, a converted warehouse space that somehow managed to feel both industrial and healing. The boardroom was impressive, glass walls overlooking a meditation garden, state-of-the-art presentation technology, and a massive table that could seat 20. Amara and Sarah arrived 45 minutes early to set up, running through their materials one final time. The Meridian board filed in at precisely 10, a diverse group of medical professionals, business leaders, and community representatives. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the board chair and no relation to Amara's firm despite the name coincidence, was a formidable woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that came from decades in emergency medicine. She'd seen everything, survived hospital politics that would break most people, and her reputation for cutting through nonsense was legendary. "Ms. Lewis, Ms. Kim," Dr. Morrison began, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone used to life-or-death decisions. "We've reviewed your preliminary materials, and I'll be frank. We've had 3 other consulting firms present integration strategies, and all of them treated our organizations like balance sheets to be optimized. I'm hoping Morrison understands that we're talking about healthcare systems that serve real communities with real needs." Amara felt the familiar click of professional engagement override her nervousness. This was what she'd always been good at, understanding that behind every organizational chart were human beings whose lives would be affected by strategic decisions. "Dr. Morrison, members of the board, thank you for that honest framing. You're absolutely right that this isn't just a balance sheet optimization. This is about creating a unified healthcare system that serves 3 distinct communities while preserving what makes each organization valuable to the people who depend on it." She advanced to the first slide, which showed not org charts but photographs of patients, staff, and community members from all 3 hospital systems. "Before we talk about integration timelines or cost synergies, I want to ground us in what we learned from 3 weeks of stakeholder interviews. We spoke with 247 people: physicians, nurses, administrative staff, patients, community advocates, and union representatives. This is what they told us. The presentation flowed from there, and Amara felt herself sliding into the zone where everything else disappeared except the story she was telling and the audience she was reading. She navigated complex questions about union negotiations, addressed concerns about service duplication versus community access, and presented a phased integration approach that respected each organization's history while building toward unified excellence. Sarah jumped in seamlessly when discussing the financial modeling, their partnership evident in how they built on each other's points without stepping on toes. 45 minutes into the presentation, Dr. Morrison raised her hand. Amara's heart skipped, unable to read whether this was a good interruption or a bad one. "Ms. Lewis, I need to stop you here." The board chair stood, moving to look more closely at one of the stakeholder maps on the screen. "This methodology, this approach to mapping resistance points and identifying natural champions within each organization, where did you develop this?" Amara exchanged a quick glance with Sarah. "It's a framework I developed about 6 years ago, refined through application across multiple merger and acquisition contexts. We call it the Lewis framework internally at Morrison." Dr. Morrison smiled, and it transformed her serious face. "I know. I've been trying to get consulting firms to use this approach for 3 years, ever since I read your paper on stakeholder dynamics in healthcare mergers in the Journal of Healthcare Management. You're the only firm that's actually applied it." The room went silent, and Amara felt several things at once. Pride that her work had reached people she'd never met, validation that her expertise was real and valued, and a sharp pang thinking about how Daniel had tried to convince her that her contributions were worthless. The presentation continued with renewed energy, the board engaging deeply with the strategic recommendations now that they understood the methodology's origins. By the time Amara and Sarah wrapped up their final points, it was clear they'd delivered something exceptional. Dr. Morrison stood, and the rest of the board followed. "Ms. Lewis, Ms. Kim, this is the most thoughtful integration strategy we've seen. You've done in 3 weeks what others couldn't do in 3 months, because you actually listened to our people instead of just analyzing our spreadsheets." She looked directly at Amara. I'm recommending to this board that we move forward with Morrison's proposal, and that we specifically request you as lead consultant throughout the implementation phase. The board members nodded in agreement, several standing to shake hands. As Amara and Sarah packed up their materials, riding the high of a presentation that had exceeded all expectations, Sarah's phone buzzed. Her expression shifted, from elation to concern as she read the message. Amara, she said quietly, we need to get back to Morrison. Now. The Uber ride back to Morrison's offices was tense, Sarah forwarding the message chain she'd received. Daniel had called an emergency meeting with Marcus and the partnership committee, claiming he had evidence of ethical violations in how Amara had secured his initial position at the firm 4 years ago. He was alleging that she'd used her personal relationship with Marcus inappropriately, that she'd misrepresented his qualifications, that she'd engaged in nepotism that compromised Morrison's hiring standards. He's trying to get ahead of his own review, Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. The partnership committee is meeting this afternoon to decide about his status, so he's going on the offensive, trying to make you the problem instead of him. Amara felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd expected Daniel to react to his professional consequences, but she hadn't anticipated this particular attack. By questioning the ethics of how she'd helped him, he was trying to undermine her credibility at the exact moment she was rebuilding it. Does Marcus know we're coming? She asked, her mind already strategizing. They arrived at Morrison to find several senior partners gathering outside the main conference room on the 33rd floor. Rebecca intercepted them at the elevators, her face showing controlled fury. Daniel filed a formal complaint this morning, alleging that your recommendation 4 years ago was based on personal relationship rather than professional merit, that you may have misrepresented his qualifications to Marcus, and that Morrison's due diligence was compromised by your influence. She paused. He's also suggesting that your return to Morrison now is part of a coordinated effort to sabotage his career in retaliation for your marriage failing. The audacity of it took Amara's breath away. Daniel was reframing the entire narrative, making himself the victim of her manipulation rather than the beneficiary of her generosity. That's insane, Sarah said hotly. Everyone knows Daniel's career was built on Amara's foundation. This is desperation. Rebecca nodded. We know, but the committee has to address the formal complaint properly. Marcus wants you in there, Amara. He wants you to respond directly to the allegations. The conference room was full when they entered, the entire partnership committee present along with Daniel, who sat at one end of the long table with a folder of what Amara assumed was his evidence. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, his expensive suit hanging slightly wrong, his confident swagger completely absent. But in his eyes was something desperate and dangerous, the look of someone who decided to burn everything down rather than accept defeat. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Ms. Lewis, thank you for joining us on short notice. I understand you and Ms. Kim just delivered the Meridian presentation. Amara nodded, refusing to let Daniel's presence intimidate her. We did. Dr. Morrison has recommended to her board that they approve Morrison's proposal and specifically requested me as lead consultant for implementation. A murmur went around the table, several partners nodding with satisfaction. Daniel's face tightened. Which brings up exactly the concern I've raised, he said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. Amara has always been very good at leveraging personal relationships for professional gain. It's how she got me hired 4 years ago, and it's apparently how she's securing client contracts now. Amara stood at her end of the conference table, looking at the faces of Morrison's partnership committee, people she'd worked with for years before stepping away. These were professionals who valued integrity above all else, who'd built a firm on reputation and rigorous standards. Daniel's desperate gambit had forced this moment, but now that it was here, she felt strangely calm. Marcus's voice was measured, establishing the parameters. Mr. Lewis has raised concerns about potential ethical violations in his hiring process 4 years ago. Ms. Lewis, you're not on trial here, but given that you initiated Mr. Lewis's candidacy, we'd like to hear your account of what happened in full context. Amara set her portfolio bag down, clasped her hands in front of her, and looked directly at Daniel. 4 years ago, my husband was struggling. He'd been laid off from 3 positions in 2 years, and his confidence was shattered. Our marriage was strained by his unemployment and by what he perceived as the embarrassment of having a more successful wife. She continued, her voice steady, letting the story unfold without dramatics. Daniel explicitly asked me to step back from my career because, in his words, my visibility was emasculating him and making it harder for him to find positions in the same industry. Against my better judgment, I agreed to what we framed as a temporary pause, believing that supporting his career rebuild was what partnerships required. Around the table, several partners shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the gendered dynamics at play. When Daniel still couldn't secure interviews after 8 months, I made a decision. I reached out to Marcus, whom I'd worked with successfully for years, and I asked for a meeting. That meeting took place at the University Club on March 15th, 4 years ago. Marcus nodded, confirming the date. I remember that meeting well. Please continue. Amara looked at her former mentor. I told you that my husband had talent that wasn't being recognized because of resume gaps, that his employment history didn't reflect his actual capabilities, and that I believed he could be an asset to Morrison if given the opportunity to interview. And I said, Marcus interjected, his voice clear for the record, that your professional judgment had never been wrong in 8 years of working together, that I trusted your assessment, and that we would give Daniel an interview based on your recommendation. You did not misrepresent his qualifications. You acknowledged his weaknesses and vouched for his potential. That's not nepotism, that's professional networking, which is how half of our consultants get in the door. Rebecca added her voice. For the record, I was the hiring manager who ultimately made the decision to bring Daniel on board after his interview rounds. Amara's recommendation got him the interview, but he earned the position based on his case study and panel interviews. His performance in those settings was strong, which is why we hired him. Daniel's face had gone pale, seeing his narrative crumbling. But she didn't tell you we were married, he said, his voice desperate. She kept that hidden, which shows she knew it was inappropriate. Amara turned to face him fully now. I didn't tell them initially because you specifically asked me not to. You said that if anyone at Morrison knew we were connected, they'd assume any success you had was because of me rather than your own merit. You were paranoid about being seen as someone who'd gotten a job through his wife's connections. I honored your request for anonymity for the first year. Then, when you got your first promotion, I told Marcus and Rebecca the truth about our relationship because I knew it needed to be disclosed. They both confirmed that the connection didn't change their assessment of your work, which at that point spoke for itself. Marcus nodded again. That disclosure happened approximately 3 years ago. It was appropriate timing, and it didn't raise any concerns because by then, Daniel had established his own track record. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're all taking her word over mine, believing her version of events, just like you've always elevated her over other consultants. She's been manipulating all of you, and now she's back here to destroy my career because our marriage failed. The outburst hung in the air, and Amara saw several partnership committee members exchange glances. This was Daniel revealing himself, showing the entitled anger that he'd been directing at Amara privately for years. Mr. Lewis, Marcus said, his voice carrying warning. I'd suggest you sit down and let Ms. Lewis finish. Amara waited until Daniel reluctantly sat before continuing. After I helped Daniel get his interview, I did step back from Morrison. I stopped taking new projects, phased out of my existing accounts, and eventually submitted what I framed as a leave of absence. I did this because Daniel convinced me that having both of us at the firm was problematic for his growth, that he needed space to establish himself without my shadow. She paused, letting that sink in. For 3 years, Daniel built his career here while I stayed home. During that time, he increasingly framed my unemployment as a personal failure. He called me a failure living off his salary. He introduced me at company events as just his wife who doesn't work. He systematically erased my professional identity and my contributions to his career. The room was silent now, every partner listening with full attention. 2 Saturdays ago, at dinner at our home, you both were there. She looked at Marcus and Rebecca, and you witnessed how Daniel spoke about me, how he positioned our relationship, how little respect he showed for the sacrifices I'd made. I returned to Morrison 3 weeks ago not to destroy Daniel's career, but to reclaim my own. I came back because Marcus and Rebecca told me that my consultant license had remained active, that there was still a place for me here, that my expertise was still valued. I came back because I'd spent 4 years making myself smaller to accommodate my husband's ego, and I was done disappearing. She straightened, her voice gaining strength. Everything Daniel has achieved here, he achieved through his own work. I opened a door 4 years ago, but he walked through it and built something. I won't let him pretend that helping him was unethical, and I won't let him reframe my return as revenge. I'm here because I'm good at what I do, because Morrison wants me here, and because I deserve to have a career that reflects my capabilities." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of truth fully told. Then Sarah stood from where she'd been sitting along the wall, technically not part of the committee, but present as Amara's project partner. "If I may," she said, her voice firm, "I've worked with both Amara and Daniel over the past 3 weeks. Amara has been collaborative, generous with credit, and genuinely interested in developing junior consultants. She's everything Morrison claims to value. Daniel, on the other hand," Sarah continued, clearly having decided to burn this bridge completely, "has taken credit for my analysis multiple times, has created uncomfortable dynamics with Elise Chun that required HR intervention, and has consistently positioned himself as the sole genius behind collaborative work. The pattern Amara describes from her marriage mirrors what we've seen professionally." Another senior consultant, James Park, raised his hand. Marcus nodded for him to speak. "I've worked on 2 projects with Daniel over the past year. Both times, he took ideas from junior team members and presented them as his own in client meetings. I flagged it to my project lead, but nothing came of it because Daniel's overall performance ratings were strong." More voices joined, a cascade of observations that had apparently been accumulating. Daniel's face went from red to white, realizing that his colleagues had been documenting his behavior, that his reputation was far more damaged than he'd understood. Marcus raised his hand for silence. "Thank you all for this context. Mr. Lewis, Ms. Lewis, you're both dismissed while the partnership committee deliberates. We'll call you back when we've made our decisions." Plural decisions, Amara noted. They were deciding about both of them. The wait was excruciating. Amara sat in her office with Sarah and Rebecca, none of them speaking much, just existing in the tension of waiting for other people to decide their futures. An hour passed. Then, 90 minutes. Finally, Marcus's assistant appeared at the door. "They're ready for you." Walking back into that conference room felt like moving through water, everything slow and significant. Daniel was already there, seated in a chair against the wall rather than at the table, his entire posture defeated. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his expression serious, but not unkind. "Ms. Lewis, Mr. Lewis, thank you for your patience. The partnership committee has reached its decisions." He looked first at Amara. "Ms. Lewis, this committee finds no ethical violations in your actions 4 years ago. You operated within professional norms for networking and recommendations. Your decision to step back from Morrison was your choice to make, and your decision to return is welcomed. Your position as senior consultant with partnership track standing is confirmed." Marcus's expression hardened as he turned to Daniel. "Mr. Lewis, this committee finds a pattern of concerning behavior that is incompatible with Morrison's values. This includes misrepresentation of collaborative work product, inappropriate credit attribution, creation of uncomfortable professional relationships, and failure to maintain the ethical standards we require of senior consultants." The room was silent as Marcus continued. "Your employment at Morrison & Associates is terminated effective immediately. You'll have until end of business today to collect your personal effects, and HR will coordinate your exit process. Your outstanding projects will be reassigned." Daniel's face crumpled, and for a moment, Amara felt an unwanted surge of pity. Whatever he'd become, whatever he'd done, she'd once loved him enough to sacrifice her career for his. Watching him lose everything was satisfying and sad in equal measure. "You can't do this," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I've given 4 years to this firm. I've closed major deals. You're destroying my career over gossip and personal revenge." Marcus's voice was firm, but not cruel. "We're holding you accountable for behavior that multiple colleagues have now documented. This isn't about your marriage, Mr. Lewis. This is about how you treat the people you work with, how you share credit, how you conduct yourself professionally. Those are the standards that matter here." Daniel stood shakily, looked once at Amara with an expression she couldn't read, anger, regret, loss, all mixed together, and walked out of the conference room without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like an ending. Marcus turned back to Amara, and his stern expression softened slightly. "Welcome back, Senior Consultant Lewis. Let's talk about your implementation timeline for Meridian." As the meeting transitioned to business discussion, as the partnership committee began asking questions about the healthcare integration, Amara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. She'd walked into Morrison 4 years ago, as someone's wife who used to have a career. She was walking out as herself, fully reclaimed, professionally validated, personally free. 6 months after Daniel's termination, Amara Lewis stood in her corner office on Morrison's 34th floor, looking out at Chicago's winter skyline dusted with January snow. The office had transformed since her return, no longer a time capsule of who she used to be, but a reflection of who she'd become. New artwork on the walls, photos from the successful Meridian integration celebration, and a shelf full of industry awards Morrison had won for projects she'd led. On her desk sat a framed copy of Healthcare Executive Magazine's cover story, The Lewis Method, How One Consultant Revolutionized Stakeholder Integration. The article featured her prominently, discussing not just her professional methodology, but her personal journey of reclaiming a career after years away. She'd been nervous about going public with her story, but Rebecca had convinced her that her experience could help other professionals, particularly women, who'd sacrificed their careers for relationships. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jordan. "Still on for lunch? Bringing someone I want you to meet." Amara smiled, typing back confirmation. Jordan had been relentless about setting her up with people from their social circle, convinced that Amara needed to date again. But so far, Amara had been content focusing on her career. The divorce from Daniel had been finalized 3 months ago, surprisingly uncontested once his lawyer had explained that fighting would only expose more of his professional misconduct publicly. He'd moved to Boston for a position at a smaller consulting firm, and according to mutual acquaintances, was doing adequate work while keeping a much lower profile. Amara felt nothing when she thought about him now, which was perhaps the strangest outcome of all. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even sadness, just a mild curiosity about how she'd ever convinced herself that shrinking was the same as loving. The knock on her door pulled her from reflection. Sarah poked her head in, grinning. "Ready for the partnership committee meeting? They're gathering in 5. The partnership committee meeting had been on Amara's calendar for weeks, marked simply as annual partnership review. But everyone knew what it actually meant. Morrison operated on a traditional up-or-out model for senior consultants, and Amara had been back for exactly 6 months. This was her formal evaluation for partnership consideration. She'd spent the previous week preparing materials documenting her work. The Meridian integration now held up as a model across the industry, 3 other major healthcare deals she'd closed, her mentorship of 5 junior consultants, and her development of new methodologies that Morrison was already licensing to other firms. But as she walked into the conference room with its familiar glass walls and views of the river, she felt surprisingly calm. Unlike the last time she'd stood in this room for judgment, this time she knew her worth wasn't up for debate. Marcus greeted her warmly, gesturing to a chair. "Amara, thank you for joining us. Please sit." The full partnership committee was present, 8 senior partners who represented Morrison's leadership. Rebecca began the formal presentation of Amara's performance review, walking through metrics that made even Amara slightly embarrassed by how strong they were. Client satisfaction scores in the 98th percentile. Project profitability exceeding targets by 30%. Innovation in methodology that had generated licensing revenue. Mentorship ratings from junior consultants that praised her collaborative approach and generous credit sharing. In 6 months, Rebecca concluded, Amara has accomplished what many consultants take 3 years to achieve. She's not just caught up to where she would have been if she'd never left, she's surpassed it. Her work is exceptional, her values align with Morrison's culture, and her leadership is exactly what we need in partnership. Marcus looked around the table. Does anyone have concerns about Ms. Lewis's partnership candidacy? Silence. Then James Park, who'd testified about Daniel's credit-taking 6 months ago, spoke up. My only concern is whether she'll stay. Amara's good enough that every firm in the city would try to poach her. Partnership is a long-term commitment, and I want to know she's committed to Morrison for the duration. Amara appreciated the honesty of the question. I understand the concern, especially given my history of stepping away. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't leave Morrison 6 months ago because I didn't value my career here. I left because I'd internalized the message that my career was less important than my husband's ego. Coming back wasn't just about returning to work, it was about reclaiming my identity and my worth. She looked around the table, meeting each partner's eyes. Morrison held space for me when I couldn't hold it for myself. You kept my consultant license active, You welcomed me back without judgment, and you've given me the opportunity to rebuild. I'm not going anywhere. This is where I belong, and partnership isn't just a title for me, it's coming home. The emotion in her voice was real, and she saw several partners nodding with understanding. Marcus smiled. Then let's make this official. All in favor of offering partnership to Amara Lewis? Every hand in the room went up. Congratulations, partner Lewis. Welcome to Morrison's leadership. The celebration was champagne in Marcus's office, casual and warm, with Sarah crashing the party to hug Amara fiercely. You did it. Partner at Morrison. Do you know how many people dream of this? Amara laughed, wiping away tears she hadn't expected to shed. I know, I used to be one of those people. Then I forgot for a while. But I remembered. Rebecca raised her glass. To Amara, who taught us all that taking a different path doesn't mean you've lost your way. Sometimes you're just taking the scenic route to where you were always meant to be. They toasted, and Amara felt the full weight of the past 6 months, the past 4 years, settle into something that felt like peace. Her phone buzzed again, Jordan checking if she'd stood them up for lunch. Amara glanced at the time, realizing she had 20 minutes to get to the restaurant. I have to run, she told the assembled group. But thank you, all of you, for believing in me even when I'd stopped believing in myself. The restaurant where she met Jordan was the same coffee shop in Lincoln Park where they'd had that crucial conversation 6 months ago, now expanded to include a full lunch menu. Jordan was already there, but they weren't alone. Seated across from them was a woman around Amara's age, casually elegant in weekend clothes, with warm eyes and an easy smile. Amara, Jordan said, standing to hug her. I want you to meet Dr. Nicole Martinez. She's a pediatric surgeon at Northwestern and a complete workaholic who needs more friends who understand demanding careers. Jordan's tone was deliberately casual, but Amara caught the matchmaking subtext. Nicole stood, extending her hand. Jordan has been trying to set us up for months, but I told them I'm not looking for a relationship right now. I just got out of a marriage where my career success was apparently threatening to my ex-husband's fragile masculinity. She smiled wryly. Jordan said you might relate. Amara laughed, genuinely surprised. That's quite an opening line. She sat down, and they spent the next 2 hours talking, not as a date, but as two professionals who'd survived similar experiences, comparing notes on how they'd rebuilt their confidence, their careers, their sense of self. Nicole's story was different in details but similar in arc. A brilliant surgeon whose husband had resented her success, who'd tried to make her feel guilty for the hours she dedicated to medicine, who'd ultimately left her for someone less complicated. The irony, Nicole said over coffee, is that I'm happier now than I was when I was trying to make the marriage work. Turns out constantly apologizing for your own competence is exhausting. Amara felt seen in a way she hadn't expected. I spent 4 years trying to be less threatening to my husband's ego. Looking back, I can't believe I thought that was sustainable. Jordan watched them with satisfaction. You two are either going to become best friends or fall in love, and I'm fine with either outcome. They both threw napkins at Jordan, laughing, and Amara realized this was what healing looked like. Being able to laugh about the pain, to connect with someone who understood without explanation, to exist fully without apology. As lunch wound down and Jordan excused themselves to take a work call, Nicole turned to Amara with a more serious expression. Can I ask you something? How did you know when you were ready to reclaim your career? I keep thinking about going for department head at Northwestern, but part of me is still worried about being too ambitious or too much, which I know is ridiculous. Amara thought about it, about the moment standing in her apartment after kicking Daniel out, about calling Marcus, about walking back into Morrison. I think I knew when staying small hurt more than the fear of being big again. When the cost of protecting someone else's ego became higher than the cost of reclaiming myself. Nicole nodded slowly. That's where I am now. The fear of staying invisible is finally bigger than the fear of taking up space. Then you're ready, Amara said simply. And for what it's worth, I think you should go for department head. The healthcare system needs more women in leadership who won't apologize for their competence. They exchanged numbers, ostensibly to continue the conversation about career navigation, but Amara felt the potential for something more hovering in the margins. Not urgently, not desperately, but gently, like a door opening to let light into a room that had been dark too long. That evening, Amara sat alone in her apartment, the space she'd reclaimed from Daniel's presence and slowly made her own. The expensive furniture remained, but she'd added her own touches. artwork from emerging Chicago artists, photographs from the Meridian Project celebration, a reading nook by the window where she'd spent countless hours over the past 6 months rebuilding herself through work and reflection. Her laptop was open to her Morrison email, where congratulations messages were still coming in about the partnership. Her phone showed text threads with Sarah planning next week's client presentation, with Jordan already scheming about getting her and Nicole together again, with Rebecca sending partnership orientation materials. But it was the email from an unfamiliar address that caught her attention. Dr. Patricia Morrison from Meridian. "Dear Partner Lewis," it began, and Amara smiled at the new title. "I wanted to reach out personally to let you know that the integration you led has transformed our organization in ways that go far beyond operational efficiency. You showed us that strategic excellence and human compassion aren't opposites, they're partners. You've changed how we think about leadership. Thank you for that." Amara closed the laptop and looked out at Chicago's skyline, the same view she'd had for years but seeing it differently now. 6 months ago, she'd stood in this apartment after kicking Daniel out, uncertain if she'd survive the dismantling of her marriage. Now she was Morrison's newest partner, mentoring junior consultants, revolutionizing industry practices, and possibly, maybe, opening herself to the idea that she could be professionally successful and personally happy, that those things weren't mutually exclusive like Daniel had tried to convince her. She thought about that Saturday dinner 6 months ago, when Rebecca and Marcus had finally spoken the truth she'd been suppressing, when the careful architecture of her diminished life had come crashing down. At the time, it had felt like an ending, like everything was falling apart. Now she understood it had been a beginning, the first moment of reclaiming herself from a marriage that had required her to disappear. Her phone buzzed one more time. "Nicole, I had a great time today. Coffee again next week? I promise Jordan won't crash it this time." Amara smiled, typing back, "I'd like that. And I meant what I said about department head. Go for it. The world needs more women who refuse to shrink." She hit send and set the phone down, looking back out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably still telling himself stories about how he'd been wronged, how Amara had destroyed his career, how he'd been the victim of circumstances. Let him. She had better things to do than inhabit his narrative anymore. She had partnerships to build, consultants to mentor, strategies to develop, and maybe, when she was ready, a life to share with someone who understood that her success wasn't a threat, it was a gift. For now, though, she was content being just Amara Lewis. Not someone's wife. Not someone's project. Not someone who needed to apologize for taking up space. Just herself, fully claimed, completely present, finally home. Amara reclaimed her career, her identity, and her future. She walked away from a marriage that required her to disappear and walked into a life that celebrates who she is. This isn't just a story about divorce or career comeback. It's about the moment you realize that protecting someone else's ego isn't love, it's self-erasure. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment sharing what part hit hardest. And if you know someone who needs to hear that their success isn't something to apologize for, share this story with them. Sometimes we all need a reminder that we don't have to shrink to make others comfortable. Thanks for being here for Amara's journey. Now go reclaim your own.